And it also gave, what?
Sorry.
It gave the political rhetoric a chance to kind of calm down a little bit. And so anyway, the book finally came out in February and right before President's Day, and I've been talking about it all over the place. So are we ready to start the actual?
All right, well, thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Amy Weishart. I'm the director here at the library. We're really pleased to have Alex Prud'homme here tonight. And before I turn it over to Carl Little for the introduction, I just wanted to mention that we're a community-supported library. We really appreciate our generous donors. Most of our funding comes from private sources, so our donors really make programs like this possible. And also on your way out, please pick up a book. Books are available for sale by the Nook bookstore. It's our newest bookstore in town. And I'm sure Alex will be happy to sign them. And I also have a listing of our upcoming summer events right by the door here. So pick one of those up on your way out. So I will briefly introduce Carl. Carl Little, many of you probably know. He's the author of numerous art books and writes for a number of different publications, including The Working Waterfront, Art New England, and Maine Boats, Homes, and Harbors. This summer, he curated 2 shows, Avian Artistry, Treasures from Maine Collections at the Wendell Gilly Museum, here right in Southwest Harbor, and Clark Fitzgerald, Castine's celebrated sculptor in residence at the Castine Historical Society. He and his brother David's 4th collaboration, The Art of Penobscot Bay, is expected to come out in late fall from Island Port Press. And in 2021, the Dorothea and Leah Rapkin Foundation honored Carl Little with a Lifetime Achievement Award for his art writing. Carl also just completed an 11-year tenure here on the library board, and we really thank him for his service. Yep.
Amy, and welcome all. Northeast Harbor Library is excited to welcome back Alex Prud'homme to talk about his new book, Dinner with the President. We've already had a nice little hors d'oeuvre. Reading Alex's bio on his website is to wonder at his adventurous spirit. In his 20s, for example, following graduation from Middlebury College, he spent nearly 2 years circling the world, in his words, quote, scaling the Himalayas, crossing the USSR on the Trans-Siberian Railway, working as a fisherman in Australia, an English teacher, actor, hostel keeper in Japan, and as a janitor in Paris. Now there's the makings of an unconventional CV. Alex's life as a writer has been equally wide-ranging and daring. Freelance highlights range from Slave, a New Yorker essay about a testy soup maven, later made famous in the classic Seinfeld episode about the soup Nazi, to his article, Should Johnny Paul Penry Die?, about the debate over executing mentally retarded criminals. Originally published in Peter Brown's Talk magazine, the article appeared in the Best American Crime Writing. His work has also appeared in Best Business Crime Writing. On the book front, Alex's breadth is remarkable. He co-wrote Forewarned about terrorism and security in the post 9/11 world. In 2004, he helped his aunt, Julia Child, write her memoir, My Life in France, which inspired half of Nora Ephron's 2009 film, Julie and Julia. Alex consulted on the script. He coached Stanley Tucci on playing Paul Child and was an extra in the movie. The book was a New York Times #1 bestseller. Shifting his focus to the environment and energy, Alex wrote The Ripple Effect, The Fate of Fresh Water in the 21st Century, published in 2011, and Hydrofracking, What Everyone Needs to Know, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. It's like, what doesn't this guy write about? Alex's new book, Dinner with the President, Food, Politics, and a History of Breaking Bread at the White House, traces the central role food has played in American political history. It is an altogether fascinating read, both entertaining and enlightening. So back in June, when President Biden hosted Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, at an all-vegetarian state dinner, all I could think of was Alex Prud'homme will want to include that meal in the second edition of Dinner with the President. There will be time for questions and signing of books after this program, courtesy of the Nook bookstore. But without further ado, let's break some presidential bread with Alex Prud'homme. Alex?
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Some old familiar faces here. Please support your library. This is a great place. And the Nook, I've never heard of, new store in town. So let's support our independent bookstores. Very important for people like me. Dinner with the President is, let's see, now how do I pull this up? Oh, there we go. Good. Dinner with the President is a narrative history of the White House as viewed through a culinary lens. And I don't think there's a book quite like this before. It's a very particular way of looking at the White House and its occupants. And I find that food can be revealing, as you will discover tonight. Like any other house, the White House runs on food. But there is no building quite like 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It's at once a real home, a busy office, a social hub, a decorative arts museum, and as Jackie Kennedy put it, an emblem of the American Republic. The Executive Mansion is the most powerful house in the world, and so it follows that the meals and the food policies served there are among the most influential, seem to be missing a slide, oh well, and tasty anywhere. In a similar vein, the president is both a symbol of the nation and a flesh and blood human being with sometimes quirky tastes. His food choices bridge those disparate roles. I think I sent you the wrong slides. Oh, well, we're just going to have to go along with these slides because this is not the slide for tonight, unfortunately. But you'll get the gist of it. My apologies. It's been a little crazy couple of weeks. What the president eats determines his health and sets an example for the nation. How his food is prepared and by whom, and the context of his meals transmits his values. His food policies influence the well-being of millions of Americans and billions of people around the world. His messaging on food touches on everything from personal taste to local politics, global nutrition, economics, science, war, race, class, religion, gender, and the like. So a meal at the White House is never simply a meal. It's a series of signs, symbols, and stories. So when Ronald Reagan munched on jelly beans, so did the public, though many turned against him when he cut $1.5 billion from the school lunch program, labeled ketchup a vegetable, and ordered new White House china all about the same day. When Michelle Obama planted her garden, many people did the same, but her husband was criticized as an elitist for eating arugula. And when Donald Trump hosted a burger banquet in the state dining room, a Pennsylvania State University study found that Americans from both parties were more likely to order fast food. So at the White House, every bite counts, for better and for worse. And I'm going to fast forward through here. Okay. All right. There's Nancy, and there's Ron with his jelly beans. Okay. So food is served at the White House every day, from a sandwich in the Navy mess, as I mentioned, to the Easter egg roll. Where's that Easter egg roll? There we go. The Easter egg roll on the South Lawn, a cabinet lunch, or a complex state dinner like Lady Di and John Travolta there. And in almost every case, food is front and center. It's just that we never really bother to notice it. And as I researched Dinner with the President, I was struck by how some first families naturally understand the political and diplomatic utility of food, while others are clueless. Canny leaders like Thomas Jefferson, Dwight Eisenhower, or the Kennedys understood that their choice of guests, ingredients, and entertainment can influence and amplify their agenda. Less savvy men such as Andrew Johnson, Warren G. Harding, and Gerald Ford have discovered that a single drunken speech, poor choice of guest, or food fail can undermine their legacy. What, I wondered, would the narrative arc from George Washington and his troops starving at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to the days when squirrel stew and roasted possum were considered the height of cuisine, to space-age Sanka and Tang and Pop-Tarts, to modern kale, taco bowls, and performance-enhancing ice cream. What would all of this tell us about our commanders-in-chief, the industrialization of the nation, and ultimately ourselves? So tonight, I will give you a taste of what I found on the president's plate. And I really apologize for these slides, but we're going to skip around. This book was partly inspired by the television documentaries about state dinners that my great aunt Julia Child made. The first was in 1967, when she and her husband Paul convinced Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson to allow TV cameras to observe a state dinner from behind the scenes and show a side of the people's house that the people had never seen. It wasn't easy. The Vietnam War was not going well. There was racial strife. There were feminists protesting, environmentalists marching, and untamable rock and rollers. And LBJ had retreated from public view. But if anyone could sweet talk the mercurial Texan, it was Julia. She and Paul were former diplomats and gourmets who understood that state dinners are the culmination of days of sometimes fraught diplomatic negotiations. It's a moment of pressure release that features the best of American food and entertainment, and a chance for the world leaders to get to know each other as real human beings rather than as stick figures. In November of 1967, Johnson hosted Prime Minister Eisaku Sato of Japan, who was a very important ally during Vietnam, to a state dinner. And the chef Henry Holler prepared a sumptuous banquet, which was served in the state dining room. Guests like Vice President Hubert Humphrey, cabinet members, ambassadors, financiers, the pitcher Bob Gibson, and actors Kirk Douglas and Ida Lupino, dressed in sleek tuxedos and elegant gowns. Julia and her cameras lingered on Holler's platters of quenelle, which are fish dumplings, his fillets of lamb in a sauce choron, his delicate salad served with cheeses, and a dessert of Bavarian mousse with strawberries. After dinner, the entertainment was Tony Bennett, who got so excited that he ripped off his jacket and began to belt out his jazz tunes in the East Room. Audience cheered. And Julia, in the voiceover, notes how food had brought these two leaders together at a particularly difficult moment in history. They seem really relaxed, friendly, and happy together, and that's the point of this whole affair, she said. So the resulting documentary, White House Red Carpet, aired on public television in 1968 and was hailed as a groundbreaking event that humanized diplomacy, highlighted White House food, and demonstrated the public's hunger for an inside look at the president's life. And by the way, if you're interested, you can see the White House Red Carpet online. You can get it through public television. Julia took note of this, and in 1976, she made a second telecast, this time about the white tie state dinner that Gerald Ford hosted for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip at the American Bicentennial. This was an extra special event at the Bicentennial, which was held under a large tent in the Rose Garden. And the ceremony was choreographed down to the last minute. But just before the evening was about to kick off, a raging storm blasted off the Potomac River, drenched Washington, soaked the lawn, turned it into a mud pit, soaked the guests, and knocked down the TV camera. So they had to regroup and finally were able to carry on. Chef Holler's menu, which was one of the most memorable of his career, he'd say, began with a Maine lobster with a sauce remoulade. Moved on to a stuffed saddle of New Hampshire veal with Arkansas rice croquettes, a blanched broccoli and a Mornay sauce, salad of French Maryland vegetables, and a selection of Trappist cheeses. For dessert, pastry chef Heinz Spender created a Georgia peach custard spiked with brandy and served in fluted vanilla bombs. The meal was paired with a selection of excellent small batch American wines. And as her camera zoomed in on Holler's lobster, the 6'2" Julia kicked off her shoes. Notice the bare feet, so as not to tower over the diminutive chef, and she cooed in delight at his lobster creation. Although, despite this toothsome fare, Bob Hope's jokes fell flat that night. The Marine band inadvertently struck up "The Lady is a Tramp" when the president was dancing with the Queen. And the kicker was that the captain and Tennille were warbling about muskrat love, a song that Julia deemed rather unqueenly. Nevertheless, she was thrilled to participate in a real event at the White House with the Queen and the president. And inspired by these state dinners that she had televised, Julia went on to encourage first families to take food as seriously as the French presidents do, and to use their bully pulpit to champion regional cookery. So let's see what slides we have here. I'm very sorry, we have Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Well, that's the scene from Hamilton, but that's a whole different talk. Speaking of regionalism, Jimmy Carter defeated Ford in the 1976 election and used his love of Southern food as a way to define himself in the public mind. Carter was famously a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, who was a hunter and fisherman who cooked big vegetable stews and country ham with red-eye gravy, and was, in my opinion, the second best presidential cook after Dwight Eisenhower. At their first breakfast in the White House in January of 1977, the Carters ordered eggs and grits for breakfast. A staple of the South, grits are boiled cornmeal. Amy Carter reported that Daddy makes grits, then breaks a couple of eggs into it and adds some cheese, and it's yummy. Many Washingtonians were familiar with polenta, Grits' Italian cousin, but considered the Carters' Southern fare exotic. While New Englanders gasped and Midwesterners gagged, Southerners smiled with knowing satisfaction at the Carters' grits, Chef Holler wrote. But in time, distinguished visitors expected to be served grits, and most were pleasantly surprised they actually liked the taste. When the Carters gave a down-home lunch of fried chicken, cheese grits, turnip greens, candied apples, cornbread, and biscuits, Julia Child said, "Well, that sounds mighty good to me." And she encouraged them to go further. Why not showcase dishes from New England, the Florida Keys, Cajun Louisiana, the Midwest, Southwest, California, Alaska, Hawaii, and even Puerto Rico? Rosalind Carter was receptive to this idea to a point. Though she liked to cook, she was thrilled to have Holler and his staff provide for her family and their friends, many of whom were eager to spend the night at the White House. What she didn't realize was that while the government pays for official visits like state dinners, the first family is required to pay for their and their friends' food and drink. After her first 10 days at the White House, Mrs. Carter was presented with a $600 food bill, and she suffered severe sticker shock. She immediately cut down on the number of visitors, encouraged the kitchen to use cheaper foods and leftovers, and once asked her music teacher to perform as the after-dinner entertainment. This gets to another aspect of White House life. Food can be revealing. How first couples have balanced or failed to balance their public and private lives can be fraught and can have high political stakes. Consider the case of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. During FDR's unique 12-year residence at the White House, the subject of food was laden with political, economic, psychological, and emotional weight. Not only was food of geopolitical importance during World War II, but Roosevelt was a gourmet who spent an unusual amount of time thinking or obsessing, really, about food and drink. His heart skipped a beat when he was served something interesting: kippered herring or creamed chipped beef for breakfast, bean gumbo, abalone steaks, or chicken in aspic for lunch, buffalo tongue, oyster crabs, or tripe pepper pot for dinner. One of his favorite dishes was terrapin soup, a Native American dish that was popularized by our early presidents that FDR considered delicious. But his wife, Eleanor, disliked the earthy looks and taste of the turtle soup, which the president served with bones and flippers in the turtle's shell. Mrs. Roosevelt preferred to eat dry whole wheat toast for breakfast, almond soup for lunch, and kedgeree, a mix of fish, rice, and eggs for dinner. Mother's a wonderful woman, but she has no appreciation for fine food, Jimmy Roosevelt said. Victuals to her are something to inject into the body as fuel to keep it going. Eleanor's rationalist diet paid no heed to the flavors, textures, or associations, the emotional pleasures of eating that ignited her husband's senses. Their conflicting palates almost guaranteed marital tension, a situation made all the worse by their housekeeper, the dreaded Mrs. Nesbit. Insert scary music here. She was in charge of the White House kitchen and served the Roosevelts simple foods, simply prepared, as she put it, the cheapest meats, canned vegetables, curried leftovers, salads of pineapple slices rolled in crushed peppermint candy, and so on ad nauseum. The president revolted. "I have been getting sweet bread 6 times a week," he complained to the first lady. "This does not help my relations with foreign powers. I bit 2 of them yesterday." Ironically, some believe the gourmet president's White House served some of the worst food ever. Ernest Hemingway described a 1937 dinner there as, quote, "rainwater soup, followed by rubber squab, a nice wilted salad, and a cake some admirer had sent, an enthusiastic but unskilled admirer." His wife, Martha Gellhorn, ate sandwiches before flying to Washington. "We thought she was crazy, but she said the food was always uneatable and everybody ate before they went," Hemingway reported. "I won't be staying there anymore." But Eleanor staunchly backed Mrs. Nesbit, and the most powerful man in the world seemed powerless to control his own diet. The question is, why? Well, the First Lady never answered that question directly, but here's a hint. In 1918, she discovered that Franklin was having an affair with her former social secretary, Lucy Mercer. It was a painful betrayal, and the Roosevelts contemplated divorce. But they stayed together ultimately for the sake of family, politics, and money. Though it was an armed truce, and Eleanor said, "I have the memory of an elephant. I can forgive, but I never forget." Some historians believe she wanted to set a responsible, frugal example to the public during the Second World War. But others contend that she used Mrs. Nesbit's ghastly grub as a tool of domestic revenge. By the way, speaking of food as a weapon, I am often asked about attempts to poison the president. It's a subject with a long and diabolical history. In 1776, there were plausible rumors that the British sympathizers tried to poison General George Washington with a tainted dish of his favorite Long Island peas, but he was saved by the daughter of Sam Francis, the owner of the famous tavern that still exists in Lower Manhattan. In 1857, another conspiracy theory held that when the pro-slavery president James Buchanan was poisoned at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C., it was the work of radical abolitionists. Others claimed it was the work of black cooks at the hotel, though it turned out there were none. The real culprit, experts say, was polluted water, not poison. Perhaps the most famous case was that of old Rough and Red, Zachary Taylor, who died on a hot day in 1850 at age 65, the victim of cherries and iced milk allegedly laced with arsenic by pro-slavery forces. That conspiracy theory remained popular for over a century, but when Taylor's body was exhumed in 1991, no trace of poison was found. Instead, Taylor died of, quote, "a combination of official scandals, Washington heat, and doctors," wrote Samuel Eliot Morrison, the famed Harvard historian and summer resident of Mount Desert. As with Buchanan, it's likely that Taylor was felled by Washington's open sewers, which swarmed with flies and polluted the drinking water. He might have survived, Morrison added, but a quack doctor from Baltimore, quote, drugged him with calomel, opium, and quinine, and bled and blistered him too. On July 9th, he gave up the ghost. This story was revived in January of 1992 when President George H.W. Bush was on a state visit to Japan. At a diplomatic banquet, he suddenly vomited and passed out on the floor. It was a shocking sight. And CNN got a call from a man who identified himself as Bush's doctor with tragic news. At 6:45 in the morning in America, a CNN anchor began to report that the president had died in Japan when a supervisor yelled, "Stop!" Halting mid-sentence, the anchor then accurately reported that Bush had been sickened by a stomach flu. The doctor turned out to be a 71-year-old prankster from Idaho. Though mortified, Bush recovered, and his press secretary explained, "The president's human. He gets sick." So this story and the one about how George W. Bush, his son, almost choked to death on a pretzel are reminders of how even common mishaps can have global consequences if you're the president. I'm going to move through these slides here, see if we can find something. Okay. And now we come to my favorite main story. It began in 1912 when a boat builder from Bangor, Carl Anderson, caught a beautiful 11-pound Atlantic salmon in the Penobscot River and sent it by train to President Taft to show his honor and respect. Thus began the annual tradition of the presidential salmon. Food gifts to the White House have been a regular occurrence that dates back to the giant cheese given to Thomas Jefferson by a New York State dairyman. And there have been many other food items over the years, from Vermont maple syrup to Texas barbecue sauce and portraits of Ronald Reagan made from jelly beans. The Atlantic salmon was prized as the king of fish for its delicate flavor, and of course, because it came from Maine. And in the spring of 1931, a Maine congressman sent Herbert Hoover a salmon. Now, Hoover was a fly fisherman and a global mining engineer who ran a very efficient White House. When the salmon arrived, his kitchen quickly beheaded the fish, put it on ice, stored it in the freezer. But then the congressman appeared at the door asking for a photo of the president with the salmon for the folks back home. Scrambling, the cooks dug the fish head out of the trash, sewed it back onto the body, and Hoover and the congressman posed with the Frankenfish, and the photo rang in all of the Maine papers. Legend had it that no one noticed the surgery, and Maine did not vote Democratic for years. Unfortunately, I have a photo of that thing to show you, but oh well, next time. The last presidential salmon was delivered in 1992, a 9.5 pounder given to George H.W. Bush in Kennebunkport. Sadly, the Atlantic salmon are now endangered, victims of dams, pollution, and overfishing. A restoration effort is underway to restore their habitat, but in 2021, only 561 spawning salmon were counted in the Penobscot. Some 1,400 have been counted so far this year, but experts say that it will take at least 75 years for the stocks to recover, if they ever do. And sadly, the tradition of presidential food gifts itself has gone extinct. Since John Hinckley shot Reagan in 1981, security around the president has got increasingly tight. And after September 11th, every food gift from the public has been automatically destroyed. Further, White House food is sourced from a group of anonymous purveyors. All they know is that they are providing goods to the US government. They don't know which branch, and their provisions are sent to secret warehouses where they are parceled out. So it's virtually impossible to poison the president through the White House kitchen, unless, of course, the president chooses to poison himself with an unhealthy diet. So this is a book about the politics of food and the food of politics. And actually, this Trump burger banquet in the state dining room was a stroke of genius because it was an affront to everybody, traditionalists on all sides of the political spectrum. And it immediately connected to his voting base. It said, I like this food, you like this food, therefore vote for me, much like Reagan's jelly beans did. It turns out, I talked to some academics for this book, and it turns out that this is a very primal message that we get. When we see somebody wearing a piece of clothing that we like, we just think, oh, that's a nice shirt, but we don't really think more about it. But when we see somebody eating something that we like to eat, it goes into our prehistoric brain and it tells us, this person is from the same tribe that I am. They eat the same food as I do, therefore I trust him or her. And so intentionally or not, Trump fed into that. And say what you will, it was very effective. I mean, the images of this banquet went around the world in 30 seconds and helped to define his presidency. So why should we care what they eat at the White House? Well, food is a powerful tool of communication. And the table has traditionally been considered a neutral space where weapons are put aside, leaders get to know each other, and people can speak frankly outside of the normal channels. Furthermore, breaking bread is a basic human act. We all have to eat to survive, after all. And when we eat together, it releases endorphins, which are the feel-good chemicals that reinforce our good behaviors. So not only do we enjoy eating together, we seem to need to eat together, even when we disagree with each other. And is a very successful survival strategy. And here is an example of a bipartisan lunch with rivals. They're breaking bread together. Communal meals have been a launch pad for the American dream for nearly 250 years, and few places on earth rival the White House as a place to eat. The literal president's table, whether it's in the private dining room, on the lawn, or in at a state dinner, is a practical necessity. The president's table is a place to eat and talk. But the metaphorical president's table encompasses many meanings. It's a symbol of the nation, its bounty, and the multiplicity of voices and identities of its citizens. As our politics have grown divisive once again, the deals made in the Senate dining room or at Washington cocktail parties are withering. And our representatives have been pulling their chairs away from the communal table, as if they've forgotten our primal urge to sit down and break bread together. Yet at the end of the day, the president's table is ours, the electorate's. We voters are responsible for who sits there, what they eat, and why. Sharing food remains an essential means of human connection. We look to our presidents for leadership and must hope or insist that they inspire us to push our chairs back to the table, sit down, and break bread. As Jill Biden's grandfather said, no matter our arguments during dinner, we finish as family. Or at least, I think you're dead wrong, but let's put it aside so we can enjoy the pleasures of life together. Thank you and bon appetit. I'd be happy to take any questions or hear any stories. Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about your relationship with Julia and the impact it had on the
Sure.
White House.
Sure. Well, Julia was married to Paul Child. Paul was the twin brother of my grandfather, Charlie Child. And Paul and Julia, we live over on the other side of the island, and Paul and Julia used to come visit us. So I knew her both as a celebrity, but also as a member of the family, and spent quite a bit of time with her because they never had kids. And so my sisters and I were sort of surrogate grandchildren, and we would have Thanksgivings with them. Yes, we would cook together. There's a famous picture of my sister making lace cookies with Julia that you may see on the internet. And she never gave us cooking lessons per se. We would just learn by osmosis. We'd be in the kitchen with her, and she would put everybody to work. And she'd say, you dice the butter, and you wash the lettuce, and you help Paul find the wine. And we would cook together, we would eat together and then we would clean together. And she made it all fun. And it was really, you know, the Julia you saw on television was the real Julia Child. And she had that great joie de vivre. She was kind of mischievous. She was very intelligent. She was very inquisitive, always asking questions. And she was just a lot of fun to be with. And so when I was working with her on her memoir, My Life in France, and it was just the two of us in the room together, she was still the same Julia that you would see on TV. And you know, I remind people that her recipes still work really well, and her shows, which you can get online, are great. They're still entertaining. You're still never sure what she's going to do because she wasn't sure what she was going to do. And yet she took her cooking very seriously. And she thought of herself more as a teacher than as a celebrity. And she would call herself an eternal pupil because she thought you could always learn something new. And when I was working with her on the memoir, I was with her 2 days before her death, which was 2 days before her 92nd birthday. And she was saying to me, you know, I'm not feeling great, but I still want to go to a Chicago slaughterhouse. And I want to teach kids how to bake a chocolate cake. And I want to go lobster fishing in Maine. And, you know, she was almost 92, and that was her spirit. And then we had people coming in from all around the world to celebrate her 92nd birthday. And this was in Santa Barbara, California. And she died. And I think she kind of did that on purpose, because what ended up happening is everybody came and we had a 3-day Irish wake of, you know, telling stories, laughing and crying, singing songs, telling jokes, eating and drinking. And it was really a wonderful cathartic moment, and very much in the spirit of Julia. So, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
So if you had to, let's say, have a sort of steak dinner in any country in the world, eat there for a month, what country would you go to?
That's a good question. I'm tempted to say France. But that's kind of a cheat. So, you know, I lived in Japan for 6 months, and I really came to love the Japanese food. And I think going to a state dinner in Japan would be really interesting. And we're at a political moment right now where China is on the rise, Russia is a mess. There's suddenly the Asia Pacific theater has become very hot and interesting now. The state dinner that the Bidens held for the South Korean president recently was partly due to that. Same with Narendra Modi. You know, he's trying to shore up our alliances there. I think the Modi dinner sounded really good. I tried to get invited to that, but was denied. It was too complicated. But I'm still hoping to get invited to a state dinner. We'll see what happens. So I would say India or Japan would be my answer to you. Yeah.
Great talk, thanks a lot, it was fun. Just want to play a little game with you. You could have dinner with 3 presidents and they could order 3 courses. Who would you pick for apps, dinner, and dessert?
Okay, well, I have a couple of answers for that. The first is, if you read the introduction of my book, I open with this phenomenal dinner that Thomas Jefferson held for Alexander Hamilton, who wasn't a president, but could well have been had he not been shot. And James Madison. And this was 1 year into Washington's presidency. Madison, representing the South, wanted very badly to have a federal city built in a southern site. And Hamilton, Secretary of Treasury, wanted to impose taxes, federal government taxes, in order to pay off our wartime debts from the Revolution and create a banking system. And their fight, sounds like obscure issues today, but their fight was so severe that Jefferson was afraid it was going to rip the country apart. And so he invites these guys to dinner at his apartment in New York, in current day Greenwich Village. And he had a slave chef, James Hemings, who had studied under some of the best chefs in Paris when Jefferson was the ambassador there. And Hemings created this remarkable meal. You know, a 3-star French meal, essentially. It began with Jefferson was a famous, what we now call vegetable forward. He wasn't a vegetarian, but he ate a lot more vegetables than proteins. So it started with a remarkable Jeffersonian salad, moved on to capon, a braised beef, and then a dessert that blew everybody's mind, which was cold vanilla ice cream wrapped in a warm puff pastry. Americans weren't familiar with ice cream then, and certainly not cold ice cream in a warm puff pastry. All of this was served with incredible wines that he brought over from France. And so he marinated his antagonistic guests in this incredible meal. And they talked about everything but these two central issues that had brought them together. And at the end of the night, they're drinking brandy, and finally the ice is broken, and they've just succumbed to this meal, and they work out what became known as the dinner table bargain. And this is arguably a dinner that saved the country. And I thought that would be really cool to be a fly on the wall for that one. And in fact, I showed you the Hamilton thing. So there's a song in the musical Hamilton about that dinner called "In the Room Where It Happens." And it's all about how the deal gets made, how the sausage gets made in the back room, and it's the room where it happens. And what's funny is that the song is rapped by Aaron Burr, who was very jealous that he was not invited to that dinner. And so we have, contemporary resonance for that story. So that's one answer. The other answer is in the conclusion of my book, because I wasn't invited to a state dinner, I held my own state dinner in Washington with a former White House chef who served 4 courses, each of which has a story behind it, including a salmon, the presidential salmon I talked about. And I invited 10 people, all of whom had either worked at the White House or had covered it for the Post or were food historians or whatever. And we sat around talking about state dinners. And so the reason I did this is partly because state dinners are one of the main subjects that got me interested in this book in the first place. Second of all, it was just a great chance to find out what a presidential meal would really taste like. And it was fabulous. And then to talk about it with all these experts was really fun. So those are two answers, 2 long answers to your question. Andrew.
So easily the most obese president in American history is William Howard Taft. Do you have any idea what his daily to say was?
As a matter of fact, I do. William Howard Taft was a large man who grew to 354 pounds, which is heavy. And allegedly he had the largest bathtub ever made, created for him. And it's a photograph of 3 normal-sized men sitting in this tub, which you can find online. And he liked to eat steak, sometimes 3 times a day. And when he went on a diet, he went from a 16-ounce steak down to a 12-ounce steak. And when he wasn't eating steak, he would eat copious amounts of seafood. Or I think his second favorite meal was roasted possum, which back in the day was considered, a very sophisticated dish. And one of the things that was interesting about this book is you look at the evolution of the presidential menu from George Washington's day all the way up to the Bidens. I only covered 26 presidents, not an encyclopedia. And the evolution of the president's diet reflects the state of the nation. So those kinds of foods like roasted possum and squirrel stew or turtle soup that we used to eat, we no longer eat, and we think they're kind of weird or even gross. But today we're eating these highly synthetic foods like McBurgers or Biden's ice cream, these things that have become so processed that Washington and Jefferson would never recognize them. And so that alone, just that story arc kind of tells you about the mechanization of the nation. And I liken it to looking at tree rings where you see periods of expansion and contraction. So there's periods when there are, say, people like James Hemings, who's trained in Paris, or you had some French chefs in the early days who would produce these remarkable meals. And in fact, Hemings and Jefferson created the foundation of what we now think of as American cuisine. It was a combination of French technique, indigenous American ingredients like corn and cod and venison, turkey, with English recipes, some of the herbs and spices that the slaves had brought over, and then their own soupçon of inspiration that they use. And they combine this Jefferson sort of had the vision, though he didn't cook, and Hemmings was able to execute it. And so the two of them, a master and his slave, who were sort of more equals than those labels suggest, created what became known as Virginia cuisine or Jefferson's table, and really was the foundation of American cuisine because it was this polyglot combination. And today, arguably, we're just even more polyglot than we were then because you have many more influences from Asia and Central America and so on. But it's fascinating to see how that diet evolved over time, for better and for worse. So, yeah.
Wasn't Jefferson unusual in that he was interested in food? I mean, are most presidents knowledgeable about what they like?
No.
State dinner?
No, to answer your question, no. Most presidents are somewhat oblivious to food. Although it was interesting to discover who was a foodie and who wasn't. I think I mentioned Dwight Eisenhower. So I thought I understood who Eisenhower was. I had this preconception of him as this kind of general who was, I always see him in black and white pictures. He was kind of square shaped. He was a military guy. But as I researched him, he turned out to be this kind of polychromatic, really interesting person whose mother was a pacifist. You know, he became a five-star general and then he kind of became a pacifist. He's the one who railed against the military-industrial complex, but he also was raised on a farm, and he was taught how to hunt and fish by an illiterate woodsman, and he became a remarkable cook, and he loved to cook. He would cook for his brothers. His wife, Mamie, did not like to cook, so he cooked for his family. When he was a general during the Second World War, he made sure that his troops were well fed, which was a distinct advantage on the battlefield. And, you know, in classic Ike fashion, after the war, he became the president of Columbia University, which was unexpected. He went to West Point, but he was not a liberal arts guy by any means. But he ran this institution. And the thing he became most famous for while he was at Columbia was the student paper asked him and Mamie for a recipe to add to their cookbook that they were creating. And he sent in a hand-typed 2-page recipe for his mother's 2-day vegetable soup, which I have made. It is remarkable. It takes 2 days to make it. You start with a giant beef bone, which you boil down. The whole house smells of beef. You add all sorts of vegetables and some barley, and you cook it down, and it's this really rich aromatic soup. And when the recipe came out, it caused a nationwide sensation, and it was reprinted in papers and magazines all across the country. And I would say, you know, all the things I did at Columbia, that's the one thing that people remember. And then as president, he liked to cook. He cooked steaks on the White House roof. There's a solarium up there, so when the weather was bad, he'd cook in there and he'd fill it with smoke because there was no ventilation. And he was kind of this incorrigible cook who would trade baking recipes with people, with visitors. And but he also used food in a very wise political way, much like Jefferson. He would invite leaders from across the country to the White House for stag dinners. And it was all off the record, no journalists invited. And he would invite 10 or 12 of them, so it wasn't a big group, and he insisted that everybody at the table speak and have some questions and some answers. And in this way, he used food to gather people, but he also used it to gather intelligence about what was going on around the country. And it was really effective. And it's interesting that, you know, and this was a technique he developed as a general. He would get various opinions from his subordinates, and then he would make up his own mind about what was going on. And this was very intentional. This is something that Jackie Kennedy did. She modeled her entertainments on Louis XIV, the Sun King, who did the same thing, using food as a way to broker peace treaties or arrange marriages and to keep his enemies close, keep his friends close, his enemies closer. And so, you know, food does have this political dimension that people don't often think about. One of my favorite stories in the book is about Richard Nixon, who didn't care about food. He would rush through his meals. He didn't like to eat with other people. He didn't want to make small talk. He hated state dinners because he thought they took too long. And so he was kind of this anti-foodie. And yet the same guy who was full of contradictions was one of the most progressive foodie presidents. He really ramped up the food stamps program and created the first ever White House conference on food, where he invited all sorts of experts to come and give guidance to the White House, which was never repeated until Biden did it last year. And then he went famously to China in 1972. Now here's a guy who would eat a ball of cottage cheese with a glass of milk for lunch every single day, which is odd. And it was non-challenging fare, but here he goes to China, a nation that he loathed, run by communist Reds, as he put it, who served an exotic food that he would never touch with a 10-foot pole. And he very carefully planned for this because he had learned his lesson in losing the television debates with JFK. He understood the power of television. And he hated the American press, but he invited 200 journalists to come with him. And he knew that the cameras would be on him when he ate in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. So he met Mao and he had dinner with Zhou Enlai. And there was this exotic banquet featuring foods from all different regions of China. And sure enough, the cameras zoomed in on Nixon. Now, Nixon was not a coordinated man, but he had secretly practiced using chopsticks, knowing that the cameras would be on him. So for months, he had practiced using metal chopsticks, ivory chopsticks, wooden chopsticks, picking up a marble or a cashew nut. And so when it came time for the banquet, he very adroitly used his chopsticks to eat a chicken gizzard. And there's a picture, there's a photograph in the book of him eating this chicken gizzard. And it was, as he predicted, a phenomenal success. Barbara Walters got on television and she says, "Oh my God, the president's using chopsticks and he's eating Chinese food." And this became front page news. And it was arguably as important as the diplomacy happening behind the scenes. The second thing is, Nixon had a weak head for alcohol, and Kissinger was terrified that if he went to the banquet and started doing the toast, which they use something called Mao Tai for, which is a very powerful sorghum liquor, that he would embarrass the Americans and destroy all these weeks of preparation. And so Kissinger wrote a telegram that I reprint, where it says something like, "Under no circumstances allow the president to drink a toast!" Exclamation point, all capital letters. Well, the cameras were on him and Nixon wasn't going to back down. And he went toe to toe with Zhou Enlai, raising a toast, but he took little tiny sips. And somehow he managed to make his way through the dinner. And it was a roaring success. That dinner helped to open up China to the West. And it helped to get Nixon reelected. And it also, by accident, set off the second wave of Americans' interest in Chinese food. The first wave had happened during the gold rush when Chinese workers came to this country, and it was based in California. The second wave started on the East Coast and featured not the kind of jalopy, mushu pork or whatever we were eating, but regional cuisines, the spicy Sichuan and stuff from the West of China. And it was remarkable how this one meal, because it was televised around the world, had this ripple effect that went out. So there's a lot of stories like that in the book. So, Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I understand you wanted to show us some pictures. I'd like to share a story about our friend John Wilmedy, who put on a big exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Hudson River art, which we now call Luminist art. And he put it on a DVD, the pictures and his commentary. And he brought this to a club in Boston to show us. Well, there were pictures, but there was no sound. So we had to recreate his words.
Well, I had the opposite problem today, so and my apologies for that. Yeah, well, I knew John Wilberding briefly. Yeah. Yeah, he was a wonderful historian. Yeah. Yeah.
As you mentioned, you only did about half the presidents. Is it because you really couldn't find enough food-related material for some of them? Or?
Quite the opposite, actually. What I discovered was that every president has a food story.
Huh.
And so I did not want to create a giant encyclopedia. I wanted to do something with more focus. And so the hard part for me was to decide what not to use. And my criteria were twofold. The first was I wanted to choose the most popular and well-known presidents because I wanted to reach a wide audience. So someone like James Buchanan, for example, has an interesting story, but he's not a very well-known president, and his story wasn't that interesting. The second criteria was to pick the food story that told us the most, either about the president or the nation or the state of the world. So, for example, Woodrow Wilson had a very weak stomach, and like Nixon, he was not a foodie, and yet his food policies ended up saving millions of lives. And so, ironically, he ended up having a big role in food versus something he could barely stomach, as it were. And so, stories like that. My hope is that it will give you readers a faceted look at the presidency. Every chapter is slightly different. I try to focus on different themes and subjects as we go through this, and it talks about different eras and how that national cuisine evolved and what that tells us about our leaders and our nation. And so those two criteria allowed me to focus it down to 26 presidents. Some of the chapters are longer than others, some are just quite short. Others, like the Jefferson chapter, Jefferson was our most epicurious president, that's quite long, but it's quite involved because it also talks about slavery and France and the beginnings of our cuisine, of our national cuisine. I try to bring out aspects of food that you wouldn't necessarily think about, such as the regional cooking that I was talking about, the Carters, or something as seemingly simple as Reagan's jelly beans, which is actually more complex than you might think, because what it's really, on one level, jelly beans were about Reagan's love of acute candy. And who doesn't love a jelly bean, right? But on another level, it's about him weaning himself off of tobacco with sugar, the power of the sugar lobby, the way he used jelly beans to judge character. So if somebody grabbed a whole handful of jelly beans, that meant one thing to him. But if somebody picked out a certain color of jelly beans, that meant something else. He used jelly beans as a kind of part of his folksy humor to deflect too much probing questioning. And then, as I mentioned, there was a backlash when he cut school lunch funding by $1.5 billion at the time that he was promoting jelly beans, and called ketchup a vegetable. So ketchup is very sweet. And then Nancy Reagan ordered this 4,000-piece set of White House china on the same day. And the whole thing blew up, and they were accused of being out of touch with the American public and of promoting sugary substitutes over real food. And they had to back down and disavow all that. So, as I said, every bite counts at the White House. And so that's the kind of story that I was looking for, something that tells you a little bit more than you might think. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, fabulous, by the way. Can't looking for the book and everything else. What's next?
Well, that's a good question. I'm working on it. I'm still talking about this book, which takes up a lot of time. And I've got a couple of ideas that come out of this book, which I'm not ready to talk about yet. We'll see. I think, I've got a few big events coming up, and I'm very excited. If any of you live in Washington, D.C., Andrew. In December, I will be there and I'll be actually talking to Congress. I'll be presenting the book to the Library of Congress. So I'll be sure to have the right slides this time. But stay tuned. I'm hoping to build on this. The book is going well and it's been really fun because it involves all these subjects that I grew up with and they're sort of essential to my being. So I'm hoping that I can parlay this into something else. So anyway, thank you all very much. This has been a lot of fun. I'd be happy to continue the conversation.